whether you win the gold medal isn't actually up to you. You might be judged. You might have another competitor that's just better than you. But what is up to you and what is in your control is your output, your ability to prepare.
You're the most decorated racquetball player in U.S. history. World's strongest man. From childhood passion to professional athlete. 8-time Ironman champion. So what was it like making your debut in the NHL? What is your biggest piece of advice for the next generation of athletes? From underdogs to national champions. This is the Athletes Podcast, where high-performance individuals share their triumphs, defeats, and life lessons to educate, entertain, and inspire the next generation of athletes. Here we go.
Hey, thanks for tuning in. This is the 221st episode of the Athletes Podcast featuring Dr. Ben Sporer. You just made the best decision of your life because today you're going to learn about mindset, athletics, health, fitness, wellness, and we're going to have some fun along the way. Ben is the Vice President of Performance Strategy, Research, and Innovation for Vancouver Whitecaps FC. If you haven't heard of him, it's Vancouver's soccer team. Proper football, as they say. He's also the Performance Consultant Advisor for B210, as well as the founder of Resync Consulting, the president, co-founder of Integrated Athlete Development. Ultimately, Dr. Sporer is engineering human performance, and he's done this now with his book Output that's available now at output-book.com. But instead of you having to read this entire book, we've decided that we're going to do a podcast with Dr. Sporer and pull out some of the finer details, some insights, some of the wisdom that he's acquired along his decades of knowledge, wisdom, and experience in the sports, fitness, and wellness space. So, without further ado, this is episode 221. I want to make sure that during this episode, you're fueled, hydrated, and performing your best because that's important, even as you're listening to a conversation, whether you're walking, running, working out. We know you're an athlete because you're listening to the Athletes Podcast. So, thank you for that. Ben Sporer, Dr. Ben Sporer, engineering human performance, strategic and innovative. He's blending science and application. He's an author. He's a speaker. This is the 221st episode of the Athletes Podcast. Here we go. Number 4, Ben Sporer, as you were Bobby Orr. I know I had to start it off.
Yeah, I
with
read that. That's funny.
Well, you know, I got to do my research.
Where did you see that?
That was on that podcast that you just referenced.
Oh, yeah, this was Scott. That was excellent. I remember that. That's what it was growing up.
3.5-year-old lacrosse player, just inspired by Bobby Orr.
And I wore his number for most of my lacrosse until I couldn't get it anymore. And then I moved into a 7. Then it was a combination of 7 and 4 to 11 because I had to have 4 in there somehow.
I just heard a clip about Bobby Orr talking about McDavid at 15 saying he was going to be the best skater.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh man, that's saying something from one of the greatest skaters ever, if not the greatest.
Yeah, he was a pretty special player for sure. And obviously the game's changed a lot since then.
I feel like you've been a part of that progress from an athletic standpoint over the past couple of decades, making those improvements.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. There's a big change and shift over the last couple of decades, for sure, in sport performance and how we prepare athletes to perform on demand. But the interesting thing for me, when you think about that, it's actually athletes. Like, you can put anything on paper you want. At the end of the day, it's commitment from athletes and individuals to do the work, and that's what the best typically do is they have the ability to get in there and grind. Yeah. Like we were talking about earlier, do the grind.
Where do you want to start? Because I feel like I could dive down a million rabbit holes. You've got your new book. We could start with you as a 4-year-old lacrosse player. You also transitioned from computer science into athletics, sport, from like the enthusiastic, fanatic point of view. Maybe if you could educate our audience a bit about who you are, your role with the Whitecaps, the consulting you do, and then I can just weirdly ask questions afterwards to pique my interest.
Sure, sounds great. So I'm a physiologist by training. I did my undergrad and master's degree at University of Victoria, and then I did my PhD right back here at University of British Columbia. We're on campus right now, which is great. As a physiologist, I started early right away while I was going to school. Right after my undergrad, working in sport, started in hockey, gradually moved into Olympic sport as I did my master's degrees, and then worked throughout my rest of my education in primarily Olympic sport across a big spectrum. So I'd work from the artistic style, extreme sports in snowboard, snowboard racing, slope style, and then right through to the pure endurance physiology sports, which was cycling, triathlon, and spent a lot of time in those years, and worked up through the Canadian Sport Institute models. and helped with that for a long period of time. And then over time, with family and other pressures, moved into different areas in different spaces, and then started my own consulting company in 2011.
Sorry, go ahead.
And that's sort of, it's evolved into where I now work with a lot of different organizations.
I feel like a lot of is an understatement. I feel like you've impacted, between you and Howie, the majority of Canadian sport has been touched in one way, shape, or form, at least on the West Coast. Am I wrong?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's very flattering to even put me in the same level as Howie. But yeah, I certainly have worked in a lot of sports in BC and Western Canada and across Canada, but over the last 20, 25 years for sure, and a wide spectrum of sports.
Have you had a favorite that you've been able to work with? Sports specific, and then maybe athletes after?
It's interesting because I actually talk a little bit about this in the book, but context is so important.
Yeah.
And I have to say that I realized this probably 15 years ago, is it wasn't about the sport. It was about the pursuit of performing at a super high level and sustaining that performance. So for me, that was really the pursuit. And that's what I found I loved more than anything. And then the challenge, it was like always a puzzle. And so, sometimes it's a team, sometimes it was an individual, and sometimes it was about trying to figure out the pieces of that puzzle that allowed, that athlete or help support that athlete to reach their ultimate potential.
I guess that's what got me excited when I was reading your book, Output, because I, similar to you, am more of a fitness enthusiast,
right,
where I didn't come from a background in science, sport, physiology, but over the last 4.5 years, we've chatted with some of the world's greatest athletes in a variety of sports, researchers like yourself, practitioners like yourself, and I'm always amazed at what people are capable of doing, what they're able to overcome, some of the injuries that people suffer and then are able to come back even stronger from are just mind-boggling. And I guess that was what was exciting when your wife reached out about coming on the show. It was like, hey, this is someone who realistically, fast forward, a couple decades, is where I could see myself, maybe not in the I don't know, I shouldn't say never, but I'm like, there's a lot of overlapping interests here. And I guess that's what piqued my interest in having this conversation, because you've been able to integrate yourself within sport despite not having that interest at a young age and diving straight into that industry. So what caused that change? Because it was down in that New Zealand, Australia trip, I think, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, it's so I've always loved sport. So I remember anytime just growing up as a kid, I would be in my basement with a friend, and we just create a game and compete. I loved to compete. And so it was not about competing to win. It was just the aspect of competing. And so sport was always a really good avenue for that. And I played lots of different sports growing up. And I think that trip that you talk about when I went down to Australia and New Zealand, I was working in computers. I had gone and done a degree in computers or diploma into computers, and really enjoyed the critical thinking aspect, the problem solving. But when I was traveling, I realized that one of the things I really enjoyed when I was down there was watching these new sports I'd never been exposed to. So rugby league, cricket, rugby union I'd seen a bit of, but in Aussie rules football.
Wildest sport.
Yeah, some crazy sports. And I'm just going, but every one of them captivated me.
Yeah.
It wasn't like, oh, I don't like this sport. And people would say, oh, I don't, rugby league sucks, rugby union's the one. And I'm like, they're two totally different sports.
Yeah.
They look the same, but they're different, And so I just loved how people prepared for them. And I don't know if you've ever seen this, but the State of Origins match in rugby is that people play on different teams, but when in State of Origins, they go back to play for Queensland or New South Wales. And these guys play against each other in the State of Origins match. And they're competing at the highest level, even though they're teammates regularly. And they get bloodied and they work hard. And I thought, wow. Just that ability to challenge yourself to be your best in these different moments. And so when I was on that trip and that sort of personal journey, if you call it that, I came to realize that I wanted to get back and work in sport. And so I wasn't sure how or where. I knew I wasn't going to be an athlete. I was a little old for that.
Yeah, same here. I'm still working on that.
Yeah, and I was never really good enough to be a professional athlete in that regard. But I realized that I wanted to be involved in sport. I wanted to be around that pursuit on a regular basis. And so I found the path that really connected with me I looked into medicine, I looked into physio, I looked into coaching, broadcasting, all these things. And I remember going to University of Victoria as I went into my undergrad, went into my undergrad, and I met Dr. Howie Wenger, and the first day I just was captivated by him and his energy.
Okay, so how does one of the most distinguished physiologists in the West Coast, Canada, fail out of UBC?
Well, I think that's funny you brought that up, but yeah, no.
I don't mean to. I just okay. It's fact.
So I think it's like anything, right? And I think it's the same thing that happens even with athletes in sport. And I talk a little bit about this in the book, but you have to understand why you're doing something. And I went to university early on because I thought it was expected of me. Right out of school, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. I bounced around from different programs. I certainly wasn't interested in what I was learning at the time, although I was interested in it. I wasn't passionate about it.
Okay.
And so I was finding other things to do, having fun with friends, socializing, and I got to a point where I just was, not super interested in what I was trying to follow at that time. And I joke about this with my kids right now because they laugh about it too. Whenever they get a report card or something, yeah. And fortunately we haven't had to have the discussion yet about you might fail, but and I just decided that I think passion's a big part of it. Like really understanding what you love to do and being connected with that. And I have to say that since I've gone back to school and although I've worked all through school and when I was going to school, and then I work a lot. I often get that from my kids and my family. But I've never really felt like I've had a job per se. Like I really love what I do, and I think that once you find that passion, or you search for that passion, or you connect with something in that regard, it makes it really easy. Like I found myself, I remember going back, I remember a very distinct day. I had an opportunity to go out with some friends, and I was like, no, I'm going to go grab some food. I'm going to study. And I went to a drive-through restaurant, like served to your card, a White Spot at the time. And I remember sitting out in New Westminster overlooking a hill, and I was going, and I had my books out, and I was studying and writing in the books. And I thought, this is easy. Like I actually enjoy doing this, which, several years before I was like, I wasn't interested in it.
You weren't opening your computer science textbook to
no, that point,
reference?
I was doing
weird.
I was doing a reading about biology and DNA. I remember it to the moment.
Weird. The only reason I bring that up is because you hear it on social media, which we talked about before, the pros and cons of it around like, trust the process. You got to go get your degree after school. Some people are like, it doesn't even matter. You just got to go learn it. Make sure you figure out how to learn, how to, allocate your time properly, time management, whatever. When in your case, you didn't need that. You needed...
Well, I did actually.
Oh, you did?
You know what's interesting about
okay.
And that's the thing, like a no regrets process. Like every aspect of what you do, I find you have to, there's always things to take from it. And in fact, in hindsight, I look back and think, well, even though they called them failures because I dropped out, they were actually incredible learning experiences. I learned a lot about myself. I learned that I actually hadn't learned how to study and prepare in high school. It was really easy for me.
Okay.
So I never learned those skills that you had to have, and I had to go and acquire those skills. I had to put the effort in to gain those skills, the technical skills, right? I had to have the mindset to be able to think about, I'm going to make a sacrifice here to know that the bigger picture is here. Like, even like we get that failure transcript, but it is actually a learning process. And so and we do that in sport now too. Like we have a poor result as a team. Okay, great. Well, what did we learn from it? What did we take away from it? We have a great result as a team. What did we learn from it? Did we actually play well, or did we? So that reflection process, I think, is really big, and I did need that. Like for me personally.
Well, and it's only a failure if you don't do anything with it, right?
Right, exactly. It's a learning experience otherwise.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I guess that was, I'm always curious when people look back and do the reflection piece. Are there things that you would change, or when you're having these conversations with your kids, for instance, how are you taking what you've learned and then trying to apply that as a parent? Are you looking back on your experience? Are you seeing how others approached it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think a bit of both.
Yeah.
I think a bit of both for sure. Like one of the things I try to do, and my kids may not agree with me on this, but one of the things I try to do is rather than say you should do this, is to try to encourage them to really figure out what they want to do. So in those situations, like I do think, yes, you got to trust the process, but if I look back, it would have been great to learn earlier on that I really should follow what I want to do. I really should learn how to think as opposed to just do. I should really, one of the biggest skills I think is important, which I learned after that phase, was about critical thinking. Like critical thinking, and it's really commonplace now. It wasn't commonplace. It was rote memorization for the most part.
Yeah.
Schools weren't teaching critical thinking.
There was only
one
system.
There was only one university that taught critical thinking processes, which was McMaster, and then as a sort of module of how to actually learn. And some teachers did it here and there, for sure. And obviously I was exposed to it from Howie.
Yeah.
But I think, that process and just getting into the critical thinking and diving into those questions and asking yourself what is it do I like to do, and why am I making these choices?
Yeah, having like a logical approach and mindset is important. Dr. Nick, who's on Instagram as the fittest doc, we just had him on the pod, and he's like, he was an engineer by trade, went to school for it, and then afterwards went and got his medical degree because he's like, now I take an analytical, logical approach to everything. There's no bias because of how I feel.
Right.
It's based on numbers, data. We hear weights clanging and banging downstairs, music going right now. I'm assuming those guys are just following the training protocol that you suggest right now.
Our team here does. Yeah, I personally don't. There's a lot of other people that do it, and they're way better at it than me. But I think the reality is I think there's a healthy balance between the two, right? Like there is one of the things we have at this club here, and I think wherever I go, I try to regularly encourage this approach, is it's really data informed. It's not data driven.
Okay.
I think you run into a challenge when you become data driven, and the easiest way for me to describe that is like data sets tell you information when you have lots of data, which is good, but they basically tell you information about populations. They tell you information about groups, and even within that, there's a whole distribution of how people respond and don't respond to different types of interventions, call them, right? So I think there's a data-informed approach that allows you to bring that into individual context. So, and I often use this example, like I've given a talk before to a room of strength and conditioning coaches, and about the concept of really understanding personal context. And I think everybody acknowledges that. But if I ask the room, I say, how many people here can build a program to increase someone's vertical jump?
Everyone should put their hand up.
Everybody puts their hand up, right? How many people in this room can build a program? If I asked you all to show me the program, how many would be the same?
50% probably similar? 20%? 10%? 5%?
I bet you there's probably maybe 5%.
Okay.
Because there's going to be nuances, right?
Yeah. You
bring your biases, you bring your past experiences. Well, how many people would do the exact same program for every client they work with?
None.
Some would. True.
Actually, fair.
So a lot of people
shouldn't.
would. If they do a data driven or a cookie cutter mass production, they would.
Okay.
But the reality is that your program might not be the best for me, and my program might not be the best for you.
Yeah.
But mine might be the best for me, and yours might be the best for you. And so it's not just about the physiology of it. It's actually about all those other things that go on, like how much time do you have? What's your history of training?
Right.
What do you like? Do you like to be in a room where there's lots of other people? Do you like to do it in a competitive environment? Do you like to be solo? Do you like that solitude? And so application to personal context or team context is really, really important.
I guess two questions around that is like how, if I'm a 15, 16, 18, 25-year-old athlete, how do I go about identifying what works and what doesn't for me? Is it just trial and error? Are there certain things that you would suggest?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and I think it is a bit of trial and error.
Okay.
I think there's also some inward reflection that's always required, and that's not always the easiest, right? When you're
14 years old.
Come on.
That's what I was thinking about. Yeah, for sure.
No, but it's not even close. But I think there's ways to do that in very simple ways, like to look at what do I like.
Yep.
Do I like to be with a group or do I not like to be with a group? Like some simple things. I think the other challenge that exists that makes it more difficult is what's the best program for you will change.
Right.
Right? So it's not just dependent on your likes and your dislikes. It's dependent on your your age, your upbringing, your training age. As you train, the best program's going to be very different for you.
Your nutrition, how your body's adapting.
Yeah. Are you physically maturing? Is your hormone levels changing? Like, there's so many things, especially for a developing athlete, right through to, you know, early mid-20. And then once you get into that mid-20, you have a little window there that's things are pretty stable. But then they start to
deteriorate.
Yeah. The physical side starts to fall off the other side, especially on the strength and power piece.
Right.
But you maintain and are able to develop a little bit more of that capacity endurance component. So,
are you telling me it's all downhill for me from here?
No, I'm not.
Okay.
Mine's uphill. It depends where you are.
Okay.
It's all relative.
I just had to make sure. I'm at that late 20s part, you know.
Yeah, well, I will say that, you know, there's a lot of people I know who become better athletes after the age of 30.
Why is that?
Their previous background, their specificity of what they're trying to do. So some might move from an athlete who's much more power, explosive, technical sport. Hockey's a good example.
Yep.
To an athlete that's more of a cycling, endurance-based sport, or a different type of sport that requires different skill sets, which take longer to develop. Okay.
If there was one thing that you could suggest to that athlete who is at that 30-year mark, or 27, and they're like, I feel like my body's slowing down, I'm not performing the way I was, reframe mentally, looking at your data, reviewing, like what would be, if you're going through
like
it
an elite athlete or a casual athlete?
Yeah, both.
I think they're different.
Yeah, it's all context.
Yeah, I think it's all context for sure. I think, and that's the same as whether you're 45 or 27, but I don't think there's one. I would say that there's a couple things to do is just really reassess, like we can touch to the book here on that spot. Like just reconnect with what your objective is. What are your goals? If you're an elite athlete, your goals might be very different than a recreational athlete. But then I always start with the phase of like, what is your objective and what's the output that's actually required to achieve that?
Yeah, I guess that is probably where we should start in your book. That, like, people look at inputs, outputs.
Yeah.
Your book's completely focused on the output because at the end of the day, the outcome doesn't necessarily look at what the output was. And I'm butchering it, so maybe you can articulate it.
Yeah, so it's a key principle in the book, and it's actually why the book ended up being called, we decided on the title of Output, was that performance, really the book's about performance, and it's human performance, and that we often measure performance in outcomes, right? Whether it be, did you get the sale? You know, did you win the championship? Did you get an MVP? Like all these different outcomes. Did you win the gold medal? The reality, though, is that, you know, my experience, based on lots of support in sport, was that you don't have control over the outcome. Whether you get the sale isn't up to you. It's about who decides whether they get the sale. Whether you win the gold medal isn't actually up to you. You might be judged. You might have another competitor that's just better than you. But what is up to you and what is in your control is your output, your ability to prepare. That's in your control. And your ability to execute the output. Those are the things that you're actually able to control. And so the premise behind the book and a fun underlying principle is that, you know, high performance is all about output. And sustained high performance is being able to prepare yourself to deliver that output that's required to achieve your objective. And what you do in that regard is you don't actually guarantee your likelihood that you achieve your objective. What you do is you actually increase the likelihood. You put your performance window in a bandwidth that increases the likelihood that you're successful.
So you set up 3 Vancouver Whitecaps players along these tables. You give them the exact same ingredients, and you ask them to bake a chocolate cake. Who's making the best one? Is there one on the team, the best baker on the team?
Oh, I don't know, to be honest with you. That's a tough question. I
don't
much time up for that. I don't spend much time up to the baking side. I know why you bring that up,
I like to bring real-world examples. You did a really good job in your book of being able to explain kind of the difference between process, inputs, and outputs. Chocolate cake example to a T. I'll let you share maybe the inspo behind that. Is there a reason you use the chocolate cake example?
Well, actually, I think the reason why I used the chocolate cake example was my daughter, when she was younger, she made me an incredible chocolate cake.
Okay.
For my birthday, and it blew me away. Like, it literally blew me away to the point where it was better. And I don't know if you're a local person, so you might know Capers, which used to was in West Side, was bought out by Whole Foods, but they used to have a chocolate cake that was mind-blowingly good. Like, nobody can compete with it. And my daughter made this cake, and it was literally the best cake I've ever had.
How old was she when she did this?
She was maybe 10 or 11.
Did she have any help?
No,
Just
she
natural?
did it all on her own. She built it.
Dang.
She was always a fan of baking, but she made this cake, and she, followed the recipe, and there was some aspects to it. Like, she really worked hard on it. She'd been practicing with some friends. She practiced with some family members on baking. It wasn't like her first cake. She had baked a few, but she also knew what I liked, and she hit the cake perfectly on the nail for what it was that I enjoyed in it. And it was the ganache filling and the chocolate icing and the moistness of the cake. So all those aspects were right on to what I liked. Mm-hmm. Now, whether everybody else thought it was the best chocolate cake in the world probably would have been different, right?
Yeah.
And so in that situation, her process, her output that she delivered it won the gold medal. That's part of the premise why I use the chocolate cake.
And there's only a little bit of bias because she's your daughter.
Yeah, you know what though? And I will say this though, that her aunt had made a cake for me a few years earlier, which I thought was the best chocolate cake, and it had beat the Capers. And there was no question that my daughters beat her aunts.
Perspective changes over the years.
Yeah,
right?
exactly, for sure.
What was the highlight of writing the book? Because it's a culmination of decades of work, life experience.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of big highlights. Like, first off, it was an amazing experience to go through with Trina. Like, it was, we worked on this together. It was an incredible partner project, and some people said, "Oh, are you guys going to survive?" And we had thrived with it. So I think it was an incredible experience to go through it. Personally, from a professional perspective, I think it was one of the most challenging things I've done in a long time. Like, I really had to fight my scientific background and, history of writing articles that are scientifically referenced and, backed up by science. And it's not that this wasn't backed by science, but what the impetus for writing the book was people asking over time, what do your experiences tell us? Like, what would you do in this situation? And although I'm a scientist and I read the science literature all the time and I write articles, I also apply that in real context. And so I think one of the things that over my career has been really taking that ability to think about the science and apply it to individual context. So writing the book was really difficult for me, because usually when I sit with somebody like yourself or an athlete or a coach, I can talk to them and listen to their situation, and they're all different, and shape the message. But this book had to be written in one voice for thousands of people, hopefully thousands.
Hundreds, millions. Could be
Millions,
it might be billions after this. Who knows?
With your following, yeah, maybe it will be. No, but like to write one voice.
Yeah.
And then to write one voice, but do so in a way that was readable for the end user, the person that wanted it. It was digestible. It was in context that they could understand, but it was also like practical. It was authentic to how I work with people. Mm-hmm. That took a lot of work. Like it was a lot of rewrites, I worked with an editor, a couple different editors over time, and it took a lot of finagling and rewriting and pulling sections out. And I think that was probably the hardest piece. So professionally, it challenged me in ways I hadn't been challenged in a long time.
I think that was part of why I appreciated reading, or I was able to appreciate reading it so much more. I equate it to like, you'll throw on a Huberman Lab podcast, and it might be a little overwhelming when he starts throwing out some big words in there. And you're like, okay, layman's terms, please, right?
Yeah.
You provided real world examples, right? Baking that chocolate cake, your experiences from the past. And I think that's what can separate good from great, is allowing the masses to be able to consume and then apply what you've hopefully. Obviously, Huberman does it well too, so I shouldn't say he's
I listen to all those podcasts too, and I think one of the things that we set out from the very beginning not to recreate was there's amazing books out there, like Atomic Habits, Outlive, Peter Attia's book, and Huberman podcast. There's tons of people that are doing a really good job in presenting science in all these different areas, whether it be longevity, whether it be personal performance, whether it be, leadership aspects. And we didn't want to recreate that science. And so what I really wanted to do with the book was create a framework for people to take all the information, take all those other resources, and apply it to their own context to think about that. So that was really an objective. I hope we've achieved that.
Definitely.
I think feedback we've had from people has been really positive, but at the end of the day, the readers will decide what works for them, and hopefully a few people really enjoy it for that reason.
We were down in Seattle a couple months ago chatting with Megan Young from Seattle.
Yeah.
And then it jogged my memory. You talked about work, and your family says you work a lot, but you don't feel like you work a lot. Can you touch on balance? If you look for balance in life, if you think balance is not a thing in life, I'd love to get your opinion on that, because I've received so many different.
So I will say this. I think I don't believe in a concept of balance per se.
Cool. We're on the same page.
I don't believe in a concept of balance. I use a model of performance for everything.
Okay.
But where I think most people trick themselves when they talk about balance, and that's to say that doesn't mean I don't believe in multiple facets of my life. I believe in being true and honest about what is my performance objective. My performance objective is to be a great father, a great partner, to spend personal time on myself, and be really good at my career, right? Mm-hmm. And that's my performance objective.
So you got your 4 or 5 buckets then,
I've got my 4 or 5 glasses of water on the table. If the pitcher example from the pitcher of water from the book is like, those are my buckets. I also realize that I can't be the same as a person that is strictly in one bucket. Mm-hmm. So I judge my performance on my output in those buckets relative to my objective. I also prepare myself to say, what can I do? How do I best prepare myself to achieve that objective? Mm-hmm. And sometimes that means making a sacrifice, not going on a guy's trip to skiing when I'm going to be able to ski with my kids. So those are 2 different things, right? But they're both how I weigh those. And it doesn't mean I don't go on guys' trips. I'm going on a cycling trip next week, which is great to California.
Heck yeah.
And sometimes I balance my work with personal objectives. So it's just being true on that objective. And then someone might look at that and say, well, that's actually balance. Well, it's actually not. It's not balance. Sometimes it's one of those gears is a bucket's a little bit fuller, more full. Sometimes they switch depending on what's going on and what's needed. But my objective is to be the best I can be in all those.
Yeah, I guess I asked selfishly because I'm trying to figure that out in my life. And sometimes I look at it as seasons now, right? And it's a season where there might be more professional work being done than personal, or vice versa, right? And you go through different seasons in life, and that's the way it's supposed to be. You mentioned your fitness, you're going cycling in a week. What is you said you were never going to be a professional athlete, so now I stick to that and pull on it, because you're still obviously one of the smartest people when it comes to physiology. So how do you now maybe apply your, we'll call them mediocre genetics that you were provided at a young age, to now still trying to...
Come on, I think I have great genetics.
You said it. I was just going with what you said. But how are you applying what you know now to, still be performing at your best, even when it's just on a guy's trip?
Yeah, so I don't know if I'm actually performing my best all the time, but it's best for what I have at this moment, right? So
love that.
And I'm really comfortable with that, right? And I think the cycling trip's a perfect example. So the last 4 or 5 years when I've done this, it's a local development team. Okay. And they have a master's group that goes down, but we support and sponsor and I help a lot of the younger riders out at times over the years. And many of them go on to be on national team or on pro teams down the road. And they're probably one of the longest standing national development teams, young development rider teams in North America. Wow. With plenty of them gone to world championships and national teams. But when we go down to this camp, I also go with a lot of friends and colleagues who are they spend a lot of time on training.
Yeah.
And I'm not as fast as them, and I can't keep up with them, but I'm okay with that. And my objective for each year at that camp is dependent on, what else is going on. Last 5 or 6 years, my kids were in that age where they needed a lot of more attention, and now this year I've been able to focus on a little bit more. And my expectations to go down to that camp from a performance perspective for myself are to be able to ride some of the bigger rides, to be, you know, a little bit quicker some of the climbs, but to do so in a way that I feel really good about myself, right? That's how I judge my performance on that. So each year it sort of shifts and it's different.
Yeah. It just feels like you've stripped away all ego associated with, like, I just look at it, I'm like, man, if I get on a straightaway with one of my buddies, I don't care. Like, I go back to 12-year-old Dave where it's just compete and win, right?
Yeah.
And I'm like, that ego aspect would be tough for me to strip away, even though I'm aware of it. Even if my performance isn't where it should be, I'm still going to break my body trying to do it.
I still have an ego. Don't get me wrong. I still have an ego when it comes to that. Like, if we're on a straightaway and I will sprint, if it's a sprint for a signpost, like, I will do it. I'm going to sprint and compete with myself and that person. But if I know that person's been training,
not going to beat yourself
my
up
expectations are that I'm going to beat that person. Like, if I even make that person suffer, like, that's a victory, right? Like, if I make that person suffer, and I'm proud of that.
Yeah.
Like,
it's interesting because you brought up on a previous podcast, it was like, you know, you set this arbitrary goal to run a 6-minute mile and then you hit 6:05. Despite it being an incredible feat still, you're pissed because you didn't get 6 minutes.
Yeah.
And I, like, set out some arbitrary number to get like a 500-pound deadlift and a 5-minute mile. And I then listen to your podcast and I'm like, man, I'm an idiot. Like, what am I doing, right?
It's all relative, right?
Yeah.
And I think at the end of the day, it doesn't mean you can't do it. Like, it's just got to be relative to your performance. And the other thing I talk about in the book is a little bit, and I think this is a thing, I think even elite athletes and high performers that aren't, you know, they're in executives or entrepreneurs, my experience shows me they're not often realistic. They set expectations that aren't realistic, for one. Doesn't mean don't have a hairy, audacious goal at all. I totally am for that. Shoot for the stars. But they're also not realistic about where their profile is at. They're not honest about the fact that they're going to have to put in this much work to make that much change. And so their expectations sometimes are a little bit like, well, you know, I think you put on one of your posts, it was maybe your post, I'm pretty sure, the Deion Sanders.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Yeah, like, are you willing to do the work? Like, you know, like, that's a big thing. Like, I talk a little bit about that at work in the book. And it doesn't mean grind mentality. It doesn't mean, like, you know, the hustle culture, which can be hugely detrimental. I think it can be negative on people's performance in lots of spaces. But it means, are you willing to do the work that's required to actually achieve your objective? If you aren't, that's okay. But just be then realistic about what your objective is.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest thing. A lot of maybe kids more, I refer to myself as a kid still, people in my generation are struggling to see, like, okay, what do I actually want to do?
Yeah.
So that's an interesting, you're like, hey, figure out what your objective is, work back from it. But I'm like, hey, Ben, Dr. Sporer, I don't know what I want to do.
Yeah.
So again, going back to just trying.
Yeah, well, I think,
you like.
And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's like start here and then it goes there. It's constantly a back and forth, right? My objectives change over the course of my career. My objectives change every year, and I think one of the challenges that we're faced with in the modern generation, obviously with social media, we talked a little bit about this before, is there's a lot of, like, comparison, and I'm not there's millions of people that talk about this. It's everywhere.
The thief of all joy.
Yeah, like, the reality is that we still compare. And so you ultimately got to get to a point where you're able to say, well, what do I want to achieve? Well, who am I? What do I want to achieve? Because person X has written something on a post, or that doesn't mean that that's what I should want to achieve. And then also, if your achievement isn't at the same level, it doesn't mean you shouldn't be happy about that achievement or, you know, elated about achieving that. And we talk about this a good example will be Olympics.
Right.
So there's a lot of people that go to the Olympics that do have incredible performances, but never once you're heard from, right? They might have been a top 16. They got in because there's always like 30 plus people in an event. Yeah. Do you know everybody past the first three or even the first one? No, but those people may never have had a chance legitimately to win, but they come because of country. Yet they hit a PB by 5%. They timed everything perfectly. Incredible performance. If you judge that performance on whether they won the medal or not, or whether the person who finished second was like faster, that's not judging performance. Mm-hmm. That's comparing two different people. It's judging on outcome, right? And so that's why I think go back to the book is that, be really clear on what is your performance relative to you. Understand the output that's required to deliver that. And then are you able to deliver on that? If you prepare yourself to deliver something, you deliver on it, high performer.
And I think that's where Sam Reinhart struggled after first year in the NHL. He's like, maybe I'm not receiving the output that I would like.
It's funny you bring him up. He got his 50th goal last night.
Well, that's why I did. I was like, hey, this is kind of a big deal.
It was pretty tiring.
He's got a quote in his in your book, So I figured there's at least you're probably allowed to bring up some stories that you have with Sam, and I figured maybe given his 50th goal, an incredible season with Florida, he's had a crazy trajectory. Yeah. I'm not going to attribute all of that to you, but I feel like you've had an impact on his career since that moment that after his first year he started talking with you, right?
Yeah. So, Sam's a perfect example. Like, literally, he's a perfect example for the book. So, Sam knew where he wanted to go. He wanted to put in the work to do it. He has a great team around him. He's still probably somebody I talk to every day via text. Nice. And he's able to prepare himself every night. And if you actually ask him, I'm pretty sure he would probably say to you right now that he knows what he has to deliver on the ice every night. He goes out and prepares himself to do it. He makes a sacrifice throughout the summer. He took the long view of building up his capacity to tolerate. And I think there was a quote earlier this year where head coach Paul Maurice had said something about Sam's able to play the minutes we need him to play now. He's prepared himself to do that. Well, that just didn't happen overnight. He put in the work. He knew where he wanted to be from an objective perspective at the end of the day and prepared his body to deliver that output over time. Mentally, physically, technically and tactically.
And I guess that's part of where it's probably super interesting for you to work with a team where you can say, I got Sam Reinhart, but I got 20 other players that I can manipulate, and he's got good aerobic capacity, he's got good strength, and you mesh them, create an ultimate high-performance team?
Absolutely, and I think one of the things that's been great about the project with the Whitecaps for me was, 2019, the ownership group asked me to speak about, try to develop a performance strategy for the club that would provide sustainable performance over time, and be part of a group to help establish that. And I think that was an exciting project for me. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of people at the organization that have come on in 5 years and are huge to that. You need to have the sporting director's done an amazing job at this club. The head coach has done amazing. The players that are bought into a team mentality. So there's all these things that have to come together to play, and often we have a lot of practitioners here who have bought into an approach of preparing and strategically going about sort of driving performance to the club. So it's been a really exciting time.
You've got your fingers in so many different organizations, areas. Is there, and you said you're just a fan of sport, competing as a whole. Is there one that really gets you going, or any stories? In particular, stories, sports that you're like, oh, I really want to go there, or you referenced the Olympics, for example. I know you've referenced previous things in the 90s before I was even born. Are there things that you look back on that were pivotal moments or events that you're like, this solidified why I'm doing this, and I'm never going to change what I'm doing?
We wouldn't be able to talk about performance and not include the word protein because they go hand in hand. For you as an athlete, protein is important. There's no second guessing it. Typically at least 1 gram per pound of body weight, 0.8 if you want to get really fancy with it, but 1 gram per pound is a good goal to strive for. And that's what I use Perfect Sports protein for myself personally. I'm having to get 200 grams of protein per day. That makes it a heck of a lot easier when I include a scoop or two of diesel protein, that being New Zealand whey isolate. It's the best on the market. If you've tried it, you know that there's no other protein out there quite like diesel. So use the code AP20, save 20% yourself. Buy as many protein powders as you possibly can. Let me know your favorite flavor because they have so many. I personally love the Canadian maple, but I want to know what you like. Back to the episode featuring Dr. Ben Sporer.
Yeah. Wow. I think there's so many, to be honest with you. Like, I think I wouldn't say there's one pivotal. I do think that there's some times where key moments where I realized that the biggest impact you can have is to not screw things up. So when I say that, is like, it's really high performance in a moment is often about not being able to deliver on demand.
Okay.
Right? Success in the moment is often being able to not deliver on demand.
Right.
So if you don't prepare yourself, you're never going to be able to deliver on demand, right? But, and often you'll hear people say, well, it's 90% mental in the moment.
Ben Hogan.
Yeah, well, there's many of them to do it, like, and he's one of them for sure. But there's other people even now that will say, like, it's all between the ears. Like, when I get on at the start line or at the moment of my event, and I get one shot at the Olympic Games to do a freestyle or a half pipe run or whatever it might be, you have to be able to bring all those pieces that you've prepared yourself together to an integrated performance. Like, it's mental, physical, technical, tactical. So I think that anytime that there was moments like that in my career, and I watched people deliver on those moments, was really just reinforcing about that's high performance. And I can even, like, now just thinking about it, like, I get like tingles and shivers, like times when, great example is JCJ Anderson. I don't know if you know who JCJ Anderson is, but he's an Olympic snowboarder. He was actually the favorite to win the gold medal in Nagano when Ross Baghdadi won. He crashed out in one of the preliminary rounds. Vancouver 2010, he had prepped so well as a team, like the year before I had joined snowboard, and they took all the efforts to put in the work to, like, think from board technology to, environmental conditions to, it could be rainy, it could be foggy. We knew what was going to happen at Cyprus. The event was going to be here. To, like, pre-warming, what happens if there's a delay? To, like, where do we put people to, we're going to ride sleds up when we get into the semifinals. How do we stay warm? Like, all these different things that came into play. And the coaches and the athlete and the support staff and the team are so tightly focused on delivering and working together as an integrated sort of amoeba, per se, as one unit. And then you watch it come together and you see those moments where the athlete delivers in demand and you think, wow, that's pretty cool. Like, and all those pieces bring together, and they just reinforce that belief that when you do things very strategically and you prepare and you put in the work, and that doesn't mean you always win. He happened to win a gold medal that day on Cyprus because we had other athletes that finished in a silver medal, and it was a great performance. But you increase the likelihood that you're able to perform in that environment, and that to me is examples like that are always really sort of, reinforcing that desire to be in a high performance environment.
I think 2010 definitely solidified that for me. Probably a ton of other Canadians too. Just that whole that event.
You were in a perfect age for that too.
It's a funny story. My mom had to drag me to go downtown to pull me out of school to go downtown just to be a part of it. I had no idea the impact and the scale at which the Olympics were and how big of a deal it was. I was grade 7, grade 8, like crazy looking back, grade 7. And I'm like forever kicking myself about that because it was such an opportunity. I was still thrilled, obviously, like, you go to Crosby's Golden Goal, all those type of events, and they stick with you for the rest of your life. You're watching it in gym class with buddies that you can look back on. But I also remember that being like, oh, look at how many people were united by one single, like everyone knows where they were during
Oh
that
yeah,
Golden
for sure.
Goal, right? And
I know exactly where I was.
No other, like, business, science, nothing does that like sport.
Sport is very powerful that way.
That was one thing that just, it resonated because from doing my research, you've had that itch from a young age too, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Was that from your parents?
No, I don't think so. I think it was I remember watching the Olympics as a little kid from a very young age. I think I shouldn't say it wasn't from my parents. Like, obviously, my parents put me in sport, so I think that was a big part of it. I think I played most sports when I was younger, and I had success when I was younger. And I think, but when I remember from a very young age, like I used to just love watching sport on TV. And I'm going to date myself here. Like, it's like anything. Darts is one of them. But like, I remember watching, it was black and white TV at our trailer we had, where we'd go for the summer holidays, and I'd watch the Summer Olympics. And I'd do whatever I can. And there was nothing else on TV because we only got one channel, and it would be like CBC, and it would be the Summer Olympics, and I'd watch every event that was there, and I'd just be like, this is so great. And it was just a competition. Sometimes somebody would win, and I'd never know anything about the sport, or then I'd be like super excited to watch this person come from behind and win. And it was just that environment that really sort of, I think, just being exposed to it, and partly my parents and partly just, yeah.
How have you seen sport change since then? Like, have there been paradigm shifting moments? I think of like the ice bath over the past couple of years, the influencer is
it's
like...
funny you should say that. I actually was listening to a CBC thing on the ice bath today, which actually was, sorry I had to interrupt you.
No.
It was about skeptic science around the fact that ice baths aren't, people are doing them for all the wrong reasons. But even then, the science is like, again, I couldn't help but listen to it and say, like, yes, but context is really important. So, sorry to interrupt you.
No, it's what's your objective?
Yeah, like
that's what it comes down to.
I think it comes back, and I always try to align action with purpose, right? It's a big thing I talk about in the book, and so people would often ask me, should I do this? And I'm like, well, what are you trying to get out of it? Yeah. Even today, like when we do a training session, or when work with a coach, or even Sammy, he'll be like, what's the purpose of today's session? Well, yeah, I know you can go harder, but today's session isn't about going hard. Mm-hmm. Today's session is about recovering, so tomorrow's session is a better session, or and so I think it always comes back to what's the purpose of what you do. Ice baths, yes, we've known for many years, I'd say probably 15 years plus, that ice baths blunt responses, protein responses. We've known that, we've had evidence of it for a while. And same with antioxidants. Antioxidants can be a blunting response from a recovery process, but there's certain situations. If your context is to get adaptation from training, then I would say never take ice baths, ever. There's no reason for it. If your response is to say, if your purpose is to say, I need to recover so I can be the best output tomorrow, ice bath's a perfect moderator to try to facilitate that, right? You're not worried about adaptation. It's less than 24 hours away. Yeah. I need to make sure I'm as recovered as possible from today for tomorrow in back-to-back games and back-to-back competitions.
Makes sense. So what if I'm doing ice baths just for the mental benefit?
Well, again, I would go back to say, understand, and I use this topic in the book, and maybe that's what you're getting to, is the concept of net performance impact, right? So I think that's one of the pieces that I try to encourage a lot, to really think about what's the net performance impact. And that's not just in the thing that you're thinking about, right? And we could, whether it be a training session, or whether it be an ice bath, or whether it be, what is the purpose of your doing it? And then if you take away a little bit of adaptation, does it matter relative to the mental aspect you get? Mm-hmm. And the only way you can ever answer that is to be really clear on what your objective is, make sure you understand where your gaps are, and then know why you're actually doing the different interventions or moderators that you would use to get to that, to achieve that objective. Because your point's a really good one. If you're doing it for some mental refreshing, mental focus, it allows you to stay aligned with what you're doing. It creates habitual behaviors, and that has a bigger impact on you personally on a day-to-day basis to get the other things done. Mm-hmm. If you lose a little bit of adaptation, it's okay.
Because ultimately nothing is completely isolated.
No, everything's integrated, right? And actually, that was the original title of the book, was Integrate. We tried to think of a play on it, but it was too complicated of a word, so I was like, forget it, this doesn't work. And Output was the natural title. But I think, we often, and I see this a lot in sport organizations, and even, we talk about these integrated health clinics, and this is another sort of pet peeve of mine, is that integrated does not mean just having people in the same location, or having someone for each of these roles, or acknowledging that you have mental and physical or medical and a masseuse and a physio in the same clinic.
They still all need to be communicating.
Integration's an action.
Yeah.
It creates, it's a verb. It requires you to actually do something. And that means you to sit and talk. And it also doesn't mean just talk or tell you what I'm doing and you tell me what you're doing. It means actively thinking together to say, okay, what's the net performance impact of what you're doing and I'm doing? You know what? Right now, my thing might be I'm dialing back on this, so this is where we get more from. That's integrating.
Yeah, and if you're going to be training heavier, then I got to reduce what I'm doing on this end. Right?
Whatever it might be, yeah. And or if mentally that's that training that you load that you're trying to get in, because a perfect example is an executive who has a bike coach, and the bike coach is saying, this is a program that's perfect. It's going to get you really fast, really quick. Anybody can build a program that gets you really fast, really quick for yourself, right? It's not going to be pro level. But that program requires you to train 5 days a week. And you go out and you try to put it, and it's high intensity because HIIT training makes you faster, quicker, for sure, we know that. But that intensity that you're putting into those sessions, both mentally and physically, the recovery that comes from those sessions, cumulative sessions over 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks, the impact that has on your ability to think when you go to work or be focused with your kids, and how those things integrate together is different.
So do you do basically assessments from afar on people? Like if you were looking at me, you're like, oh, Dave's got a couple things on the go and he gets after it in the gym every other day. He might be redlining it, or are you doing like assessments like that? Do you look at it that way? Is it? I see.
So, are you asking me if I've looked at you and what you do and
no,
everything?
I'm not. I'm just using me as an example.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't say that. Like one of the things I've learned is that, again, I go back to context. Like I don't know.
Yeah.
And I actually use this example all the time in pro sport too, because I'm pro in Olympic sport. Is that, especially, and I'll use media as an example.
Yeah.
Media, broadcasters, paper, whatever it is, bloggers, they often look at sport from retrospective perspective, right? They're strictly looking at what happened. And that's because that's what's available to them.
Right.
They see it, they look at the data, they look at the score line, they look at the box scores, they look at the data streams that come off of it.
Outcome.
Well, part of it's output, but some of it's outcome for sure. Some of the data that comes from a data stream might be output on field or on the ice, but that's only one piece of it. It's what happened in the game. It's actually what happened in the 90 minutes. But I do know that there's a lot of things that happen throughout the week. We missed 3 training sessions. Something happened at home for the person, for that one athlete, and their dog died. Or, there's so many things that come into play. So to judge something from afar, like your question, what you're doing, I would say it's totally doable. I don't know what else you're doing.
Yeah.
But the context would be, I would sit with you and ask you, oh, so what else do you do? Like, tell me more about what's your objective? And if I see you doing a whole bunch of other things that really aren't giving you net performance impact on your objective, I would ask you, I would question you on that. Say, how does that actually lead to what you're trying to do? Or how does that fit to your total objective? Because you say this is your objective, but you also got these other things here. You're not really acknowledging that those are part of your objective.
How hard are those conversations to have with super high performers?
That's a good question. I mean, I interview every person I work with, and some people, I think they're not hard to have questions. They're not hard to have those discussions. I'm not saying everybody responds to them the same way. I think a guy like Sam responds to it really, really well.
Okay.
There's other athletes who I've sat down with, and they're not ready to hear that, and that's okay. And there might not be an alignment between what they think they want versus what they really want, which is to be. So there's many athletes that are out there that play at an elite level because they're incredibly gifted.
Yeah.
They've got great talent. They love to play, but they want to be at the next level. But they don't really want to do what it takes. Back to your Dion post. They don't really want to do, but they're very happy being here, and that's okay. I have no problem with that. And so sometimes it's always about the right fit,
Yeah.
Is it the right fit? And so I don't think that approach is the right fit for everyone because they're just not necessarily ready for it.
I guess crystal ball sitting in front of you here. If you were to look at your past experience now, formulate Genie, 3 wishes, do you have a bucket list, things you want to do for the remainder of your career when we chat again in a couple months, years? Like, are there things you want to have checked off that list? Obviously, you got the book now, but are there other areas in sport that you want to touch, impact? Like, I'm always curious.
That's a good question. I've never really thought about like a bucket list on that regard. I think I'll continue to work in sport just because I love it so much, but I think one of the things I'd like to do is, and that's part of the reason why we did the book, was to just really expand the aspect that human performance is for everyone. It's not just for elite athletes.
Love that.
Like, everybody's a performer. And the other thing I think that's really important, I think would be a really cool thing to see happen is that people approach life from a performance model. Because at the end of the day, that's what we all do. It may not be like world's best executive but what is the world's best executive, right? What is the world's best athlete? I think ultimately, if you think it from a personal approach, is if you take a model of performance for your own personal life, and sometimes we use medical models, and I'm not the biggest fan of medical as an aspect of performance. And I think if we take a model of performance to think about physical, mental, technical, tactical, what's required for us to achieve what we want to achieve, that everything sort of falls into place. And so I think it would be really cool to see that become more commonplace, as opposed to people think it's not for them, but it's actually for everybody.
I love that. The Athletes Podcast is for everyone. I try and articulate it that way because that's just the name.
Yeah.
We're all human beings. We're all capable of being athletes in one way, shape, or form. Right?
So true.
And it's interesting you bring up that, like Justin Roethlingshofer, who I don't know if you're familiar with, in Miami. We were just training with him a couple weeks ago. He used to train Penguins, a couple other NHL teams, and he started Own It, and he does cellular testing.
Right.
And he was diving into all the science around that and how it's beneficial, and people are just doing blood panels, and that's like, surface level compared to cellular. So I'm learning all about this stuff now, and I'm probably going to go try and get some of that work done. But Devin McConnell, who's the performance
Arizona
coach for he also talked about the fact that you can also get almost too deep into the science.
Way too deep.
And you don't want to get that deep in the data. So I'm like, on a weekly basis, having these conversations, fascinated by what everyone brings up, but like, okay, again, back to the Huberman layman's terms, how do we identify when we're doing too much or not enough?
Yeah, it's that is one of the questions I get asked most often, and while I love the science, and while I think there's a time and place for it, and I do think that there's value in all these different aspects. I touch on this in the book, right? Like, and everybody refers to marginal gains, right? And I think that, like, don't get me wrong, David Brailsford and marginal gains is an incredible process to go through. But like I say, I was there in 2008 when I watched them. They had great coaching. They had great athletes that were committed to doing the work. And they had already taken care of all the fundamentals. So, people get bogged down in all these little icing on the cake per se, but they make a really crappy cake, right? Yeah. So they don't put in the work. They don't think about what are the objectives. They chase different ideas, and while the cellular testing might be really key in some key spots, but are you going to be able to action that? Are you going to be able to put that into your life, into your daily scenario? Is it going to make the difference for you to be able to actually put some of those things in play? And I like what Devin says about that, because the reality is often as humans, we see all this stuff come up and we're excited about it, and it's quick fix, and it's it's accessible. I just have to pay a bit for it. I can get it. And it gives me some interesting information, but what are you able to do with that information? And I'd liken it to, in sport, we get inundated with, my inbox is full all the time. New technology. Try this, try that. Yeah. I mean, but there's certain things to say, well, it's great. I love that you get all this technology. I even did some continuous glucose monitoring on myself.
Nice. James Wendland, big fan of that too.
Yeah, what's that?
James Wendland, he does it every morning. He was talking about.
Yeah, so I had it for 2 weeks because a lot of people asked me about it, and I said, you know what? I'm a scientist. Yeah. I'm a physiologist. I understand this information, but I'm also going to tell you, like, I don't need that much information. But I think there's a time and a place. Are you able to action it? Are you able to do you have a team around you? Right? I talk about that in the book. Do you, like, if you don't have the skill sets, do you have a team that's able to support you or provide you feedback on that? And even in sport, like, if we have technology, I used to use this number and it's made up, but it's for purpose of explaining it, is that for every $1 you spend on technology in a sport, expect to spend 10 on staffing to make it functional.
That's good.
Right?
I would love that if people...
$10,000, if you want to buy $10,000 or $30,000 worth of equipment...
You need a salary for that person.
Salary for multiple people.
Yeah.
If you're buying $30,000 a year, you probably need anywhere between $150,000 to $300,000 to make sure that you're getting the most out of that technology in the field of play. You can get some with a little bit here and there, but is it worth it if you're only getting some? So I think that's a really key message I try to drive home with people. I'm not anti-technology. I'm not anti any of that. I'm actually very pro it. But don't do it at the cost of getting your fundamentals, and don't do it if you can't utilize it.
I just imagine waking up, I'm 2028 Olympic Games and my whoop score is 17. I'm like, I'm just not going to go after it today. I'm like, there's things you got to do as an athlete, right?
Well, it's interesting. I'll tell you a little story here. I'm working with a snowboard cross athlete from Canada who's actually having probably the best season, arguably the best season ever in snowboard cross. But one of the things we implemented a little bit of technology into his routine this year, and he's got a great team around him. But they weren't able to fully utilize the technology. And this year we were able to utilize it a little bit more. And we're able to make adaptations. And sometimes the technology is saying, you're not ready. Well, what do? Do we say, oh, you can't go compete? No. You find solutions and you have the ability to make a decision on that with a team around you to then say, how do we rise above that? Right?
Yeah, back it off a little maybe.
Or just it is what it is.
Yeah.
You're not going to be able to change it now.
Yeah.
Know that you're prepared and go out and deliver.
Is there value in just ignoring it then and not even looking at it at that point? Like morning of, you're like, man, if I got a 99 recovery or a 15, it doesn't matter. I got to perform. Like, do I bother looking?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
There's sometimes there's a value to say fake it to make it. And you talk about, integrated output. It's not always going to be perfect.
Yeah.
So do you have the mental skills when it's not perfect to be able to rise above that, to fight through it, to fake it a little bit?
I just got to check my notes here, make sure I'm not listening or missing anything. I have a couple quotes I'm going to include at the beginning in the intro because it's just better for me to read them in person instead of that. But the one thing I guess I want to wrap up on is the fact that you have worked with high performance executives, athletes. Everyone at the end of the day as a human being should be performing their best. You mentioned a couple of things. As someone who's listened to the show, the way we wrap up is we ask our guests their biggest piece of advice for the next gen. This is a specialized population that is human beings, and we're all high performers. So I'd love to just let you share any other insights, nuggets of wisdom, pieces of gold that you'd like to leave our audience with. And it can be anything from, sometimes faking it till you make it is what you need, or down granular statistics. And anything I missed during the episode, I'm sure we'll keep in contact. But floor is yours.
I think there's probably a couple things. The first is that the factors that drive human performance are fundamental, and they're the same across all domains. You can break them into hundreds of domains, but the same things drive human performance. You have a physical aspect, you have a mental aspect, technical and tactical. Some of those domains require bigger aspects from physical or bigger aspects from technical or tactical. And so I think the one thing I would challenge your listeners to is to look at their own performance objective, really be honest about what it is, then understand what's required of them to deliver on that from those domains. The second thing I'd say I think is really important pieces of wisdom or advice, or typically I come out is to really prioritize and don't get bogged down in all the add-ons, all the icing per se, and really prioritize fundamentals. Like, there's a reason why a lot of people are talking about sleep, nutrition, physical training. Like, they're core fundamentals for just human health as a whole. But they're also core fundamentals for performance, right? And I think that they're core fundamentals because they impact, and the integration of those aspects on the ability to execute technically or tactically are really important. So I think that understand that don't get bogged down with all the niceties of the icings, and just really focus on the fundamentals. The third thing I'd say is that you ultimately have to be willing to put in the work. So if you think you have an objective, be honest with yourself. I see so many athletes and executives and even just people and friends in life where they will tell you that this is what they want to achieve, but they're really not honest about the other things that they want to achieve. And so they look at these things in isolation. So if you want to be at some point a good husband, let's say you get married and you have kids, your objective changes, right? It's not just about running the podcast and VR and all these other things. It's actually about being a parent and running my companies. Mm-hmm. And so your objective is actually slightly different, and what's required is going to be different. Mm-hmm. So understand that and just be honest about what it is. Quite often I see people say to me, and especially when you go from the executives, but it works in both ends, when the executives come to me and they've got sport goals, they often are like, oh, I want to be the best cyclist in this. And I'm like, okay, but you also have to run $1 billion company, right? Like, you also have to have you're a dad to a 14-year-old and a 12-year-old.
You got to keep those other buckets full.
And so they're not really honest about what they're asking of me. They're honest about that perfect individual goal. So appreciate that they're all integrated and they're actually highly dependent on each other.
Okay, we got a first challenge from someone at the end to challenge what your actual goal is, what you want.
Did I challenge someone?
You did. I think that was the first thing. You said I challenge your listeners to go after and make sure they identify what they actually want, and whether they're willing to put in the work.
For sure, yeah.
And then focusing on those fundamentals. That was brilliant. It's been an honor, Ben. I appreciate your time.
Glad we got in. By the way, happy birthday.
Thank you. No, hey, this is what I love doing.
And you crossed the threshold today of being less than half my age to being over half my age.
There you go. It's always interesting. I have a lot of people bring up the fact that they were doing research before I was born, and I say, hey, that's why I'm still here learning.
That's
right?
great.
I got a lot to catch up on. Where can people find your book? I know you're not always social media. I'm
on LinkedIn as Ben Sporer, and
okay.
then I think the book is output-book.com. Okay. And it's available on Amazon and usual sites. So
amazing. Thank you folks for tuning in.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Awesome.
Hey, just wanted to say thank you for tuning in to this episode. This is the 221st. You folks have been along for the ride. Don't forget about our athlete agreement. This is something that I don't talk about enough at the beginning of our episodes. So we're getting it at the end. Just hit that subscribe button. We really appreciate you being here. You've tuned in. You've listened all the way through this episode. And for that, I can't thank you enough. My name's David Stark, host of the Athletes Podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in. We'll see you again next week. Bye.